So we have today with us Vadim Karatayev from University of Guelph that is doing a postdoc with Bauch, Madhur, and Anand, and he will talk on the far side of the COVID-19 epidemic curve. Local reopenings based on globally coordinated triggers may work best. Je vais faire aussi l'annonce en français. Donc il y a Vadim Karatayev de l'Université de Guelph, au-dessus de Waterloo au Canada, et son coordinateur Chris Bauch, qui vont nous présenter un travail sur l'épidémie de Covid et sur le déconfinement. Please, Vadim.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so yeah, I'm a postdoc with Chris and Madhur, and I'm kind of by training, I'm a mathematical ecologist, so I study multiple attractors and spatial dynamics in ecosystems. So it's kind of a new foray for me in very quick time, but Chris is very much the main epidemiologist on this to note. And so, of course, we're kind of in the situation where the best way we have for dealing with this thing is by closing schools and workplaces to try and reduce the number of contacts. And so initially we started with closing down entire provinces or entire countries. That was very important to getting everyone kind of on the same page, figuring out how we do this mitigation, how we kind of set up testing to where it's kind of an acceptable pace and rate. But as of course, this has been quite expensive, and so there's kind of been more and more pushback against this coming from businesses, et cetera. And I'm also the person in our group who's from the United States, so all of these debates for us in the United States get dialed up to 11. But so now as we're kind of getting into the later stages of the epidemic, there's some questions of whether we can do kind of a phased approach where we kind of start opening up the places that have been impacted less or have already recovered before we open up the entire country, right? So can we save some, reduce the total number of closures that we have by doing this? Or is there kind of a really high risk that if we open up some of these places that are doing okay now, then travelers will kind of reintroduce the epidemic into those locations and cause a second wave or renew the epidemic spread in those places that are doing well right now. So there's kind of a balance there. And so essentially this comes down to a question of what spatial scale should we make these decisions and lift school and workplace closures? Should it be across across the entire country or in an entire province? This is kind of a global strategy I'm going to be referring to. Or should we open up individual cities or municipalities as they get as they recover? And I'm going to be referring to these local locations as counties. So the basic structure is that we're going to be modeling so there's about 49 counties in the province of Ontario, Canada. And people move around between them. So this is some data on where people work and where people live. So this is kind of like the travel matrix in this system. And so it's a discrete space model. So we have 13 million individuals, but they're all kind of within an epidemic compartment. They're all kind of the same. So the disease progresses from susceptible, exposed, kind of classic, and then asymptomatic, infected, and recovered. We also account for a little bit of heterogeneity in how many contacts people have by modeling super spreaders separately. So those are people with higher transmission probabilities. And then for testing, I'm going to be mostly just showing results for where only people who have symptoms get tested. So once you're kind of in that infected stage, you have there's a probability that you get tested. So this is just because so far we haven't had, at least in Ontario, very much testing capacity to go and contact trace who has been exposed to the disease before they start showing symptoms. But so in principle, later on, it's very, very important to also start contact tracing and get testing of asymptomatic people going as well. And so just kind of a broad note, with these kinds of models, asymptomatic and infected people or infected people can infect other individuals. So then based on this testing results, so we can inform our management and mitigation efforts, right? So this is how we track the progression of the disease in different locations and across the whole province. So so the mitigation that we can do, so we're basically, again, reducing contacts, and I'll show a little bit later, in the calibrated model, we're saying that the most you can do is reduce about 70% of all contacts based on data that we've seen in Ontario. And so this is, again, happening in response to how many active positive cases are happening. So how many people are sick and know they have the disease. So one way we can do this is to kind of mandate month-long closures of schools and workplaces. And this accounts for about 45% of all the contacts that people have. And it can be done on, again, a county-by-county basis with this local strategy, or we can say that we're just going to be considering this at the scale of the entire province. So when there's too many cases in the entire province, we close down all counties in the province simultaneously, and similarly for reopening. And so this is just based on a threshold. So whenever cases exceed a threshold, the province is closed or the individual county is closed. Another component, of course, though, is kind of this voluntary social distancing that accounts for the rest of the contacts. And so there's a kind of social perception risk that people determine based on how many people are known to be sick in their individual county. And then also we account for people that are sick, so feel sick, so they're in the infected state, or they know they have the disease, that they tend to travel a lot less. So this determines the fraction of contacts that are remaining, so how much total mitigation we're doing. And then you can track what's the chance that you don't get infected by people in disease state, in some disease state and some testing state. So either they know they have it or they don't know if they have it. So that's just 1 minus the probability of transmission raised to the power of how many people are in your location in that condition. Now, another component to this, so this is a form where the disease transmission is all kind of mass-based, which means that if you're in a more populous county, you're proportionally more likely to get infected. If you're in a more populous county, your contacts, you have that many more contacts. In reality, of course, there's somewhere in between. So somewhere between the number of contacts that you have being directly proportional to population size where you live, or completely independent. So everyone has the same number of contacts regardless of whether they live in a village or in Paris, right? So reality is somewhere in between, and where we are with this, so in terms of this chi parameter, it's not very important to model results, but it is important that there's just to some extent number of contacts increase with population size for what I'm going to be showing. So this is for all the individuals. So you kind of have to to not get sick, avoid all the individuals with this disease state and testing state. Then we can kind of, so the probability that, overall probability that a susceptible person gets infected on any given day is 1 minus the probability that they don't get infected by anyone. So to kind of calibrate this to figure out some of these trickier parameters. So for transmission probability, we just assume that, or fit the model so that if we don't do any testing and we don't reduce contacts at all, by the end of the year, 50%, half the population is infected. And then for testing rate, mitigation efficacy, so again, that 0.7 that I showed, the fraction of contacts that we can delete, and risk perception, so we fit all these three together simultaneously to several pieces of data. So first of all, it's the time series of cumulative number of positive cases that we've had in Ontario. And this is kind of 10 model iterations here. Second is the fact that so based on studies, we think there's about 8 to 10 times more actual people infected than the number of positive cases that we have. So there's this kind of under ascertainment ratio. And this is just to give you an idea of what the fitted model dynamics look like. And the last piece of information is just based on kind of surveys around the internet, is that by about day 50 of the epidemic, about half the population had reduced the number of contacts that they have. So that's informing mostly the risk perception parameter for voluntary social distancing. Then what this looks like with, we'll start with kind of this global strategy of we close or open up the entire province simultaneously. So the x-axis is time, so days since the start of the epidemic. The y-axis is different locations in the province. So the red here are closures of schools and workplaces. So in all the simulations, we start with kind of, just as many countries and provinces have done, we've closed down the whole province for 50 days. And after that, with this kind of global strategy, what happens is that we can open up the province, but very soon we need to close it, and we have this kind of intermittent going back and forth between opening and closing the entire province. So not really great. A lot of red, a lot of workplace closures across the entire year here. With the alternative approach, so with this local strategy, we start again with this initial province closure that we've had, but then we let individual counties decide when, so we open up individual counties based on when the number of cases gets low enough in those locations. Right, so there's a lot less red here, so only a fraction of the counties are closed a lot of the time. But then if we look at the number of active infections that translates to, we see that there's a very similar number of infections between either between this global and the local strategy. So there's not a big difference in how many infections there are, but there's a lot less red, a lot less person days closed with the local strategy. And one thing you might note here is this is infections on a log scale. So most of the infections tend to be concentrated in the cities. So this is Toronto. The star here is Ottawa, which is the capital of Ontario. And so basically the disease tends to be concentrated in some of the most populated counties. And so, but on the other hand, we don't see like a tremendous resurgence in the in counties outside of like these really populated centers. So disease spread by travel might not be such a big concern, but again, as long as we can kind of, we've opened up some of these locations, but if we need to, so if the cases start increasing again, we can close down the county as soon as cases cross the threshold, right? So we can reclose places as we need to very quickly. And that's kind of a key, that's really important to this. So another thing we can ask is, well, exactly what should be the threshold at which we decide to close locations, or if cases go below that threshold, start reopening. So, so based on this threshold, you have kind of this gradient in how strict your mitigation strategy is. So all the way on the left, you allow for very many positive cases, so you almost never close, in this example, the province. And all the way on the right, you have kind of the most conservative strategy, where as soon as there's a few cases, you close down the entire province. And so again, with this kind of global strategy of closing or opening the province, we have a very kind of direct trade-off between the proportion of the population that gets infected by the end of the year and the proportion of person days closed. And so we want to try to keep infections as small as possible, but that with this strategy translates to having about 60% of all the person days closed throughout the year. So pretty high economic impact. With the local strategy, though, we see kind of a window opening up where we can have, again, opening up those locations that aren't impacted very much, but so that reduces the number of person days closed, but it doesn't lead to a big increase in total infections. And so, yeah, this still translates to that we're going to have to close individual counties if there's, for instance, 100,000 people there. Once there's more than 5 active positive cases, right? So people who have tested positive and they're still sick. So it's still a fairly low kind of fairly strict threshold. One of the things that might be interesting is, well, what happens if counties don't all behave as one? So specifically, some locations are kind of more eager to open. Some places are a little bit more careful and a little bit more conservative, right? So we have lower coordination in this reopening threshold in terms of number of cases. So as kind of this discoordination increases, we have more and more people getting infected. But then also as this discoordination increases, we also have greater and greater kind of economic costs, so the fraction of person days closed, right? And it's interesting that there's this very big interaction. If you have a lot of travel here with these pink lines, you have kind of a disproportionate increase in person days closed as you get low coordination among counties in terms of when they decide to open, right? And the idea here, which is kind of interesting, is saying some of these places that are a little bit less responsible, they open up too early, the infection spreads from those places to adjacent counties, and then the adjacent counties have to reenact and close down again, close down businesses and schools again because of this importation, right? So having kind of really tight coordination in when individual counties are allowed to open. So coordinating that at the province level is really important, not just from the public health perspective, so number of infections that we end up with, but also in terms of the economic costs. And then kind of the final thing you might ask is, well, if this kind of local strategy is such a great idea, could we have done that from the beginning? And so specifically, this is asking how important is that initial province closure that we had with this local strategy? So how did it contribute to these outcomes? So if we didn't do that initial closure, so we just started with closing down individual counties as we need to, we could have reduced the proportion of person days closed by a significant chunk, so about a fifth, without greatly increasing the fraction of the population that has gotten infected over this kind of initial period. So this could have been beneficial economically, but there's a really big caveat that if we did that, we would have had to be a lot more strict in when we require counties to close, right? So the number of cases at which you force counties to close has to be a lot lower when you're doing this. It declines if you don't do this initial closure. So practically, that means we have to close down individual locations as soon as a few cases are detected, which might be really tricky to do because it takes time to kind of figure out, okay, we're going to close down, we're going to get everyone to agree. So there's kind of a big time lag in when that happens. And so during that period, the disease can kind of take off again, and you have even more cases then. And this also requires that we have a really high testing rate. But as we get to kind of later stages of the epidemic, whereas when we have higher and higher testing rates, as we go kind of farther to the right on the x-axis in this figure, then we don't have to be kind of as stringent in when we require closures, right? So there can be like 50 or 100 positive cases, for instance, in Paris, before we have to close down the city, right? So that's a lot more kind of practically feasible than saying you have to close Paris as soon as there's 10 cases, right? That's the level of kind of information flow isn't really there. And also, particularly when you have really low testing levels. So for instance, in Ontario, very early on in the epidemic, it usually took 10 days to get test results back and process that. And so that's kind of a big problem because by then the person you tested is most likely recovered. So you really don't know where the disease is at any given point. You just know where it was a week or two ago. But then kind of on the other hand, as we get to better and better testing, this kind of local strategy might become more and more feasible, right? So we can respond in time and reenact these local closures. So basically, we couldn't have done these, in most cases, we couldn't have done this local strategy from the very beginning, although South Korea is a really important exception where they had this kind of local closure strategy and really intense testing. But perhaps this can be something, or this local strategy can be, as we get better and better with testing, can help us avoid having to close down entire provinces or entire countries, potentially during the second wave of the epidemic as we start going into the fall flu season. So this is something that can work in the future. So some of the caveats here is to what I've shown, so we're kind of we're not modeling kind of these individuals. We're modeling kind of individuals in compartments. So we're not, for instance, modeling individual specific commuting patterns. So between locations. So the person who travels from county A to county B for a day is different every day. And you can also do kind of more with explicitly modeling variance in how many contacts people there are among different people. So kind of using kind of explicit distributions for that rather than just kind of this super spreader, non-super spreader compartment. And then also kind of cases coming in from outside the province, so all of these can be really important as we get to even later stages of the epidemic when we have fewer infections. So you get demographic stochasticity being really important. So the outside importation of disease is quite interesting because this is something that initially China didn't have to deal with, and so kind of this large-scale shutdown could get you to almost allow them to eradicate the epidemic there. And this has been kind of quite a lot more difficult for other places and also for China now, as you have people coming in from outside the province or outside the country and reintroducing the disease. Some of the other interesting things to explore with this is kind of explicitly modeling kind of economic costs and kind of the economic pressure that businesses have and politicians face to open up earlier. And then if you have kind of really high economic costs, maybe businesses won't comply with them as well. So this is, again, something that is kind of a really big debate, at least in the United States, where we've had recently with, for instance, Tesla, and in California, they're kind of going in and opening up their factory against the orders of the local municipality. So it's kind of a really big and intense deal. But also, of course, this kind of plays into kind of or interacts with the background political polarization that you might have. And again, it's also very high in the United States. So some people kind of really pro opening up as soon as possible, and some people saying we should be really conservative. So to the extent that those people are kind of live in their own parts of the province, you might kind of get an extreme level of discoordination where some places kind of forego closing altogether, and other places are really careful, but they get all this kind of influx of the disease from the places that aren't being responsible. So kind of an extreme level of discoordination. And then, of course, there's interesting work you can do with adapting these closure triggers to have the hospital capacity in individual locations, testing capacity, and potentially also to population density. I guess one more caveat is that with these kinds of kind of reopening, we're sort of assuming that all of the contacts that are happening in the schools and workplaces are kind of start happening again when we open up the whole, or when we start opening up locations or the whole province. And of course, in reality, we might be a little bit more careful with having new guidelines for how we interact in businesses and schools to, again, reduce number of contacts. So perhaps we might be able to, based on these results, or eventually kind of start opening up individual cities as well very later on. So thank you.
Okay.
There's any questions?
Thank you, Vadim, for your presentation. So please, if there are any questions, please let me or ask directly, Vadim.
Gabriel, so I got a question.
Yes, Yannick, please.
So yeah, so I was wondering, so how you interpret the interest of local closure in terms of reducing the spread of the epidemics and the growth rate of the epidemic. So one thing which personally I think will not matter much is that even if you were not doing any measures of social distanciation or whatever, if you had a localized epidemics, then locally you could reach the group immunity, and so the epidemic would not spread a lot. And so yes, there's already an advantage of having something localized, even without social distanciation measures. And then there's some other phenomenon, which is that if we apply social distanciation measures or closure of schools where there is a lot of cases, it means that we lower R naught where it matters most. Okay, so that's two ideas. I think the second one is more important, and maybe there are other intuitions for why it would be important to have policies that are localized. Can you say something about that? In what's the underlying mechanism that makes it good to have localized policies?
The basic mechanism is that for places where especially places with a little bit lower population density, so where people don't have as many contacts, the disease doesn't spread as fast, and so those places you can after that initial closure period you can kind of reduce, so people might be still social distancing, but you can kind of start opening up businesses and workplaces there without the disease taking off. For again, and so you also mentioned maybe we could have done this kind of, if we know where the disease is initially, then maybe we can kind of quarantine that location and kind of stop the disease before it spreads. That's kind of on a large scale. I guess that's what China did, and to an extent, what's South Korea managed to do. And I think we tried to do that a little bit in the United States and Ontario as well. But it was more a measure to kind of slow down the spread of the virus. I guess with the things I'm modeling here, it's we kind of assumed you can't be quite as strict, so you can't kind of so you can't get to the level where you completely stop travel from one location to the rest of the province. But potentially, if you're kind of in China or in some other place, maybe that's a little bit more plausible. And so the way the dynamics work here is that if you have kind of a lot of disease happening in one county and you close businesses and workplaces there, or in schools there, then people travel to those counties less because there's because their work is closed. So to an extent, you stop or you reduce the spread of the epidemic from those locations, but you don't stop it completely because people can still travel for other reasons.
Yeah, and just to chime in, the other reason why the spatial structure is important is that if cases are rare, they could die out due to stochastic effects. And so using a deterministic model will overpredict the number of cases that you actually have. So you don't necessarily want to reach herd immunity in those areas. You're trying to avoid it. So that's not necessarily a useful strategy. But what you can do is that, because the flip side of super spreading is that, if 20% of your persons are causing 80% of the infections, then 80% of your persons are causing almost no infections, right? And so those vast majority of people who are not infecting others, usually they clear the infection, they recover, and they haven't infected anyone. So you had this very strong stochastic fade-out effect in the presence of super spreading, which is why this kind of stochastic spatially structured model is useful in these for evaluating these types of approaches.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Other questions? So let me ask meanwhile another question. So what is the, in fact, what are the determinants of the second wave? So you said that this local control could be used for the second wave too. How do you include the second wave in the model? For instance, what is the epidemic size at this point? Because I understood that you calibrated for 50%, but what is the epidemic size after control, and is this does this will trigger a second wave or not?
Yeah, so we basically used kind of the same parameters that we calibrated initially here, but we looked at a range of different kind of mitigation scenarios. So these distributions are over different levels of testing, different and importantly different levels of initial number of people infected. Right. So as you go into the, for instance, the fall, there's you have temperature changes and kind of seasonality, possibly driving faster spread of the disease. And so then when you start kind of considering these kind of closures again, you might start doing that at different levels of, at different points in kind of the second wave, right? So you might be kind of really prompt and start thinking about and start doing mitigation when there's just a few hundred cases in the province, or you might be kind of late and there might be already a couple thousand cases again, or a couple thousand new cases in the province by the time you start this individual local closures. Yeah, so we're just kind of starting with different levels of initial number of people infected. So if you kind of just kind of take that second wave as a separate epidemic in the fall. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other question?
Yeah, Gabriel, here's Yannick again.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm always surprised when you have the graph where you essentially predict that with local closure we close Toronto and another that graph, that's great. So a number of highly densely populated places, but we see that in many places, as I understand it, it stays blue all the time. So we never have to reclose a number of areas. So what is the interpretation of this? It means that in these areas, R0, R0 is naturally less than 1. And so that even if there are very few cases that come from the outside because we cannot avoid all travels, the epidemic would naturally die out in these areas if there is not too much inflow from people from Toronto going there. And if this is the interpretation, so is then your interpretation that initially there were some disease in these areas because there was really a lot of travel? That's what brought all of the disease to develop there, or is there some other interpretation of the fact that at some point the epidemic was developing there, and now we think that it will no longer develop?
Yeah. So yeah, you get this kind of very similar pattern with the disease kind of present in a lot of different locations. Even if you initially run the model where the epidemic is initially only, for instance, in Toronto, or only in one, or in any one of the individual counties, right? So even if it starts at one single point, it looks basically like this after a few weeks. Yeah, so it is spreading through travel, but it's mostly kind of concentrated in some of these more populous places, and in other counties it kind of pops in and out, basically to some extent on its own. And in a few cases, you have to enact or reenact closures in those locations. Yeah, again, this kind of initial province closure was also important to reducing outbreaks outside of cities as well, and kind of delaying the spread. Yeah, the other thing is, or kind of one interesting extension would be, so with this model, we fitted to cumulative number of cases across the entire province, so taken together. And it would be really interesting to extend this to kind of try and mimic the distribution of cases across space, so across the different locations.
Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind about that blue area, if I can jump in again, is that even though schools and workplaces are open in the blue region, people are still doing physical distancing. So they're still staying 6 feet apart, washing their hands, etc. So that does not disappear in the blue region.
Okay,
so that's the reason you see that. Yeah, that's
the difference
fade out
between
there.
that's the difference between the beginning, like before the big red zone, and after. So the behavior of the population has changed. So R0 is less
Exactly.
in the after. Okay, yeah, I understand that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the other really important thing is that you're still testing in all the locations, right? So when you find a person that's infected, and especially when you can do contact tracing and find asymptomatic people, they interact a lot less with their community. So I think the really big thing here, also in addition to having closures when they happen, is the fact that we're testing everywhere. And this was something that we weren't able to do early on.
Okay, that makes sense.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Hello. Just one question about the assumptions in the model, in the epidemiological compartment model from the beginning. Your recovered cases, there is no arrow going back to susceptibles. So I assume that you assume in this model that recovered cases are immune for the time horizon of the study. Did you try to inject in the model the possibility that recovered cases might become susceptible again, especially asymptomatic cases?
Right. Yeah. So we didn't have. We assumed kind of full immunity once you recover.
Okay.
I think later that would be really interesting to try, and especially, I guess there's some debate over how many strains we have actually. With the simulations I showed, it's so if you do this mitigation, the fraction of the population that ends up infected is 1 to 5%, maybe 10% maximum. So by the end of the year, you still have 90% of people susceptible. So with these simulations, kind of having recovered become susceptible again wouldn't kind of change a lot of the dynamic, because most of the population is still susceptible, I think. But yeah, in later stages, depending on when we get a vaccine going and get treatments, that will be that could be something that's quite important in getting to the bottom of how many strains we have.
Thank you.
Or comments or questions? Not at this point. So maybe we'll stop here for the questions. So anyway, if you have other questions, do not hesitate to either write directly or write through me. I guess the reference of the paper will be or is already on the slides, so I will put the slides on the web, so don't hesitate to ask a question for this. So thank again Vadim and Chris for coming here such a long distance, and hope to see you again, maybe in more civil times.
Yeah, maybe in person.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.